Hello, everyone. This is Sal Albanese. Welcome to my podcast, Running Against the Wind. Today, uh, I have a great guest. We're going to be discussing municipal labor in New York City. Something I've been very interested in for years when I was a council member. And the man that I have as a guest today, Richard Steier, I don't know of anyone in the city who knows more about municipal labor than Richard. He was the longtime editor of The Chief and wrote a weekly column, which I always read because of the insight it provided me and many, many others about the dynamics of unions, city unions, which of course are important to the quality of services in the city. And there's a lot of dynamics there that need explaining. Richard had a tremendous rapport with many of the leaders of the unions. They trusted him. They talked to him on a regular basis. And once again, he was a must read when it came to organized labor in New York City. Richard, welcome. And I'd like to just begin by asking you, how did you start your career in journalism, and how did you evolve into this very knowledgeable municipal labor maven?
Thanks for having me, Sal. Basically, I was cut out, I believe, to be a sports writer. My father had been a sports copy editor at the New York Post and the New York Times and the Herald Tribune, may it rest in peace. And I grew up with a primary interest in sports, but I also got interested in politics along the way. And there was a point where I was looking for work, and someone who I had worked with at a Brooklyn weekly newspaper called Courier Life was working at the health department, and one of the employees there was dating the editor of The Chief, Frank Pryle. And so she relayed to him that they needed someone, and he reached out to me, and I decided that I would go there, I'd stay a year, and then move on to a daily paper, except it wasn't as easy to move on to a daily as I thought, and I liked the work at The Chief better than I had expected. And so I wound up spending 9 years there, then went to the Post for 4 years, got fired during a strike when I had an idea about writing an op-ed piece for Newsday that didn't call Rupert Murdoch any really nasty names, but people may have drawn some inferences, and so I wasn't invited back. Went to the Chief, back to the Chief for a year, then went over to Channel 2 for a couple of years as a field producer. And then I returned to the Chief for the long term, basically about 25 years in 1997, became its editor in 1998. And that was a particularly interesting time to be covering labor and covering it with the kind of scrutiny that the Chief allowed you to use, and the kind of space that you had to be able to flesh out just what was going on. There were a couple of different corruption scandals that were starting to unfold, one involving the old Transit Police Union, second one involving DC 37. And it was just a really interesting time when people would ask me before that about whether municipal unions were as bad as some of the private sector unions like the Teamsters or the Longshoremen's Union. I would say, no, whatever corruption there is small. And well, it turned out that it was fairly large there also, and it was something that was known within the labor movement, but people didn't talk about it too much. That it was something that at one point, after a DC 37 contract vote was rigged to make sure that the contract passed so that they didn't anger Rudy Giuliani, who was the mayor at the time, I got a call from somebody at within DC 37 to tell me that Al Diop, whose union provided the decisive votes in favor of the contract, was actually living in the DC 37 penthouse, courtesy of the executive director at the time, Stanley Hill. And once he told me that, I made a few calls. One of the people who I called was the former executive director of DC 37, Victor Gottbaum. And when I mentioned this to him, Victor responded with the kind of chuckle that says, okay, you found this out. We had this under wraps for a long time, but it's out there, so I'll tell you a little bit. That There were
It's
things
amazing that
like
it's amazing that he talked to you. I mean, he opened up like that.
well, it was something where I don't think Victor figured that any blame was going to accrue to him, and the problem was that Victor had put Stanley Hill in charge as his successor, more than a dozen years earlier, uh, even though there was the feeling that Stanley was a guy who would rather be liked than respected and might not be tough enough to be able to, get people to knock off any funny business that was going on there. Uh, and so that it was something where when Victor was asked by an interviewer from another newspaper about it, he basically said that he, put Stanley there. He thought that he'd be okay, but he knew that he wasn't the best possible union leader, but he wanted his successor to be someone who was black. And I spoke with Charles Ensley, who was one of the prominent black labor leaders within DC 37, and Ensley said that's not the way to play the race card, that if he thought that Stanley wasn't qualified, people here would have been okay with him taking someone who was not a person of color, provided that that was the person who was best equipped to be able to run the union. And so that for Victor to be looking to alibi his way out by saying that now, it really doesn't hold up under scrutiny.
You always have to wonder if people like Gotbaum, who was a giant, right, kind of sometimes hope that the successor is not somebody who's of his ilk, right? Who had the same persona, and sometimes deep down they hope that people will say, well, I'm not saying that that's what Victor was thinking, but I'm familiar with folks like that who say, well, people want me back. The guy of my successor's a bum.
It's
You never
it,
know.
it's complicated. Gottbaum was someone who genuinely did a good job of picking talented people and giving them the freedom to operate while he was running DC 37. What is closer to the mark is that Gottbaum may have figured that with Stanley in charge, there was enough that he was going to have to rely on Victor for, that he would keep him on the payroll, which he did initially. He was giving him, I think, $100,000 a year to be a consultant, allowed him to keep his executive secretary from DC 37 working for him. And I think that Victor figured that he was going to have, relatively easy work advising him, not have to do very much. The problem was that there were some of the less honest people in DC 37 basically got into Stanley's ear and told him, you don't need Victor around. You're perfectly capable of running things yourself. And so that he got rid of Victor after 2 or 3 years in that role as a consultant. And these people were basically getting away with a lot of stuff that Gottbaum had looked to curtail. When I asked him about it, he said there had always been small corruption within DC 37, but that it wasn't anything that was really flagrant, and he thought that he was able to tamp it down and limit it.
So, yeah, I remember I was on a city council in '97. Actually, he was running for mayor then. I remember the scandals with Rudy. Oh God, they were terrified of Rudy, right? Uh,
Yes, I mean, it was some, and that's one of the problems, that it was something that they were worried about not angering Giuliani by voting down the contract. And what they forgot about was that they had to be more concerned about how their members would react than they did about being scared of Giuliani. That this was a situation in which the union that provided the decisive votes, Local 1549, it represented clerical employees. These were some of the lower paid people in city government, and it defied credulity to believe that they would have voted by a 5-to-1 margin. It was like 10,000 to 2,000 in favor of a contract that began with a 2-year wage freeze. I mean, people who are living paycheck to paycheck, once inflation starts getting its teeth in, you can't afford to go that long without it getting any kind of a raise, even if you're told that coming out at the other end, the last 3 years of the contract are pretty good. And so it was something where James Butler, who was the head of the hospital workers union, as soon as he heard the vote count, said they stole the vote. And Charles Ensley, who was at Local 371, the Social Service Workers Union, he didn't say that out loud. He sent a letter to Jerry McEntee, who was the head of DC 37's National Union, asked me, telling him that this ought to be investigated, that he didn't see how it could have passed by that kind of margin, let alone pass at all. And McEntee wrote back to him saying that if you have any evidence that it was fixed, let us know. And when the scandal broke and McEntee was asked why he had ignored that letter from Ensley, he said he didn't give us any proof, just an allegation. Well, Ensley was in a position where he wasn't just going to shoot off his mouth unless he had a pretty good idea that something was rotten in the state of Denmark.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Was that the biggest corruption, municipal labor corruption scandal that you covered?
In
That
terms
DC,
of in terms of the amount of money, yes. Yes. In terms of corruption involving other unions, the transit PBA thing always left some suspicion because of the fact that it was a relatively small union. I think they had about 3,500 members. Richie Hartman, who had lost his law license back in 1988 because he was gambling with money that was supposed to be used for cops' escrow payments on when they were buying homes. And he had continued as a consultant to the PBA. He could bargain for them. He could no longer be their lawyer. But he was ultimately convicted, along with the two people who had taken over his law practice and who were the PBA's in-house counsel, where basically they were paying off the transit police union officials in order to get negotiated something that was going to pay them a special sum of money every year for representing transit cops in cases where the city or the transit authority declined to represent them. There had never been a single case in which that had happened. So you had this initial $750,000 fund, and I think they kicked back about 250,000 of it to these union officials. And so the question that was always sitting out there was, if they were paying off Ron Reality and these other people $250,000 in order to get this extra business, were they doing anything similar for the city PBA while they were bargaining for them? And it's a question that's never been answered. But if the president of the PBA at the time that this was happening, Phil Caruso, had learned that the transit police officials were getting paid off, then you would have to figure that he would either have two options. One would have been to say, "Where's mine?" And the other would have been to blow the thing up and refer it to authorities. So,
yeah, I think Caruso was kind of a mysterious guy, right? I mean, no
yes,
one. There was always a lot of suspicion around him, but never. He apparently, what I read about him was he was kind of a um, uh, uh, stayed to himself, didn't have many friends, didn't talk to too many people. So that may have saved him, if he was
it
involved.
could be. I mean,
Yeah.
there was talk, and I don't know whether it was true, that for a while he had lived in Ireland, which did not have an extradition treaty, and so
Ah,
that fueled some suspicion. But I don't know whether there was anything to that or not. It was I mean, Caruso, part of that was just Caruso looked at the people who he represented and himself as being kind of above other people out
yeah,
there. It
yeah.
was, and it was bad enough that another of the union leaders at the time, Jim Gebhardt, had nicknamed him the Pope. And
They're great lines. I mean, those guys were characters. I mean, I
Gebhardt
remember.
definitely was, but he was a different kind of union leader from
Yeah,
Caruso. That
yeah.
it was
Caruso,
it,
Caruso,
one of the things that used to bother not just some of the union leaders, but mayoral officials, was that if Caruso had a problem, he could go directly to Koch and get it solved. That Koch wasn't necessarily interested in doing things based on the merits. That the PBA endorsement was extremely important to him. He had first gotten it before Caruso was president at a time when there were rumors that Koch was gay, and so that being able to get the PBA's endorsement basically countered that and helped burnish Koch's credentials as being tough on crime, even though he had been this liberal congressman from Greenwich Village before that. And so that I remember one city negotiator telling me that one of the more annoying things that Caruso ever said to him was if he was having a problem getting something through the legitimate collective bargaining process, he'd say, "All right, I'll speak to Ed about it." And basically, this official figured that, sure as shooting, uh, that he was going to wind up getting what he wanted, and he was just going to have to eat it because Koch would tell him, "This is what I want."
Yeah, he was, he also had a pretty close relationship with Mario, Cuomo as well, Caruso, as I recall, when he became governor.
Uh-huh.
Uh, he was a very articulate, guy, he didn't sound like your typical, union leader. He used big words, if I recall. He was,
Yeah, he wanted to project an image of professionalism. He felt
yes,
that some of the past leaders were a little bit too much these, them, and those guys,
yes.
and because of that, he was someone who had a high school diploma, but he read a lot, and so that he had a vocabulary that went beyond what you would normally hear from a police union leader. And there was a negotiating session that I covered along with people from the Post and Newsday and the Daily News, where they were behind closed doors in the Hotel Vista. And suddenly we hear a lot of screaming and yelling, and they're cursing out city negotiators. And the next thing you know, they come storming out of the ballroom, and we had our ear pressed up against the door trying to hear what was being said. And one of my colleagues, Joanne Wasserman, said, "Do you know who said what?" And I said, "Well, I think probably Nick Mancuso was using the single syllable curse words and Phil was using the multi-syllable ones."
Well, I'll tell you, you should write a book about this stuff.
I
Amazing.
did actually.
You did?
Enough
I
blame to go around. It was a collection of my columns in the Chief.
Oh, I've gotta pick it. What really? Oh, I gotta pick that up.
If you don't have it, I'll get a copy to you.
Yeah, I don't have it. I'd
Okay.
appreciate
Sure.
these are great stories. I was a school teacher when Al Shanker was the president of the UFT. And how has, municipal labor evolved from those days in terms of influence with Shanker and Gottbaum? And is it have they lost influence? Because those guys were considered giants. I mean, Shanker and Gottbaum over the years. Uh,
DC 37 has never really recovered from the corruption scandals. The moment they had about 3 years where they were returned to stability and they were a powerful, capable union, that was when they were under administratorship. Lee Saunders, who recently retired as president of AFSCME, was basically overseeing the union, and he had a couple of capable officials, one a veteran at DC 37, their chief negotiator, Dennis Sullivan, and another one, Zach Ramsey, who had been at both DC 37 and later at AFSCME, who had come in and were running an awful lot of that. But when Lillian Roberts wound up taking over as head of DC 37, things suffered. It wasn't corrupt the way that it had been, but Lillian just wasn't strong enough or capable enough to run the union, which was why Gottbaum had passed over her in the first place when he was getting ready to retire in the early 1980s. In terms of the UFT is still a powerhouse that um, I mean, Mike Mulgrew has kept the basic structure together. He is not as uh, media savvy as Randy Weingarten was, his predecessor, but the UFT remains the strongest of the city unions. No
you,
question about it.
you think they're as influential as they were during the Shanker days?
Probably not. Simply because of the fact that it's more spread out, that there is less in terms of political connections, and that applied also to Barry Feinstein. I mean, he's got a capable uh, counterpart today in Greg Floyd running the union, but Greg does not have the kind of ins that Barry had. And both Barry and Victor understood pretty quickly that you could do business with Republican legislators as well as Democrats and get your bills passed. And so Feinstein in particular was very tight with Warren Anderson, the longtime uh, leader of the Senate
Very
Republicans, who were the majority for close to 60 years before the Democrats finally got control back, 7 or 8 years ago. And that made a big difference. The other thing was that they had been involved in rescuing the city from bankruptcy through investments of pension funds and accepting some givebacks in terms of deferrals of salary. And that elevated people like Gottbaum and Shanker and Feinstein. I mean, Shanker had a kind of notoriety all his own because of the 1968 teachers' strike and the fact that it had its roots not in a contract dispute, but in terms of what had happened in Ocean Hill, Brownsville, and the attempt by some militant black leaders to gain community control, and Shanker standing up against them and sometimes using rhetoric that turned off Gottbaum to the point where those two guys were feuding for years, and they used Feinstein as kind of an intermediary when they weren't talking to each other in order to communicate. I mean, you had that immortal Woody Allen line when he wakes up in the future and, and asks what happened that the Earth was destroyed, and someone responds, "It was the result of a man named Albert Shanker getting hold of a nuclear weapon." I mean, I remember watching Sleeper in a movie theater in Manhattan, and the place exploded with laughter. I don't know that there would have been the same reaction if someone was watching it in Topeka or in Milwaukee, but in New York, I mean,
he was
people got the joke.
he was bigger than life. I mean, Shankar. I mean, there's a lot that whole strike had a lot of racist, racial overtones. That in Ocean Hill, Al Van was involved, if you remember.
Yes, yeah,
And
Van was one of the more militant people, and he later changed somewhat. He became more mainstream and wound up serving in, I believe, the council and certainly in the state legislature.
yeah, yeah, it was a very, very tough time. I was just in college in those days, but I remember how traumatic that strike was. And it, the Taylor Law was passed right after that. When did
The
they pass
ta-
the Taylor Law?
the Taylor Law was actually in the works before that. That strike was bad, but in terms of really tying up the city, the transit strike of 1966 as well as the sanitation strike of 1968, really made an impression upon people that it was something that transit strike, nothing could move for the 12 days that they were out. And in terms of the sanitation strike, you had garbage piling up. It was winter rather than summer. That was something that was fortunate because the garbage didn't stink as badly, but it was something that had almost doomed John Lindsay's hopes of being reelected. I mean, there are people who think that if the Mets had not won the World Series and if he hadn't been present for their victory celebration, that and the overall good feeling of the Mets winning the World Championship less than a month before the mayoral election were what propelled him back to a second term running just on the liberal line after he'd lost the Republican nomination in a primary.
Was Delory the president of the sanitation union at the time?
At the
Delory?
time, he was, yes.
He
Yeah.
was a pretty tough character. Those guys, Mike Quill, Delory, I mean, those guys were hard-nosed. I'm not sure
Yes.
yeah, I don't see that today, with the labor leaders,
Well,
they just
the thing that really changed it was the Taylor Law. That the Taylor Law, before that, you had something called Condon-Wadlin, which was intended to be a deterrent to strikes, but it wasn't really practical. That they saw that with the transit strike in 1966. Under Condon-Wadlin, workers who went out on strike were supposed to be automatically fired and could not apply to be reemployed there for 3 years after their firings. This sounds great because it sounds like you're really hitting them in the kneecaps, except for the fact that if you've got 30,000 people who are suddenly out of work, where are you going to find enough people to run the subways and run the buses? without them. I mean, it just doesn't happen. When you had the air traffic controller strike, it took a long time for them to replace 11,000 air traffic controllers. And in that case, you had a nationwide search in terms of where you could deploy people. 30,000, it didn't make sense. And that made it clear. And that was the reason they went for the Taylor law, which might seem like it was milder, but because it was milder, was real problematic for workers and for their unions, that it gave an employer the power to suspend dues checkoff, which meant that dues that were just deducted in employee paychecks, the same way that direct deposit puts your paycheck into the bank, could no longer continue. And it also fined workers 2 days for every day that they were out on strike. And in the case of the 1980 transit strike, which lasted 11 days, that cost people 22 days' pay. And they did somewhat better in their contract negotiation than they might have if if they hadn't gone out, but an awful lot of what they gained, at least for the first year or two under that contract, was canceled out by what they were paying in fines. And you just have not seen a whole lot of, with the exception of the nurses, but in the case of the nurses that we've seen recently, those were private strikes. They were not strikes against municipal hospitals. That for municipal employees, the Taylor law was really a game changer. It gave them certain protections also. That was the other thing in terms of strikes. It used to be that you would have a strike would come if you didn't have a contract at the point that the old one expired. The Taylor law had an amendment to it that came a couple of years in that was known as Triborough, under which if a contract expired for a municipal union or for any state union, which included the TWU, because it's considered a state union rather than a city union, the terms of that contract would continue in effect until you had a new deal in place. And so that nobody was going to lose anything because of that. It might mean that it would be a little longer before you'd see the pay raise, as opposed to if you'd gotten the pay raise immediately. But in the long run, they were not going to be harmed that way. And so that also became a positive deterrent against feeling the need to go out on strike.
So, how do you see organized labor, municipal labor, um, interacting with the new Mamdani administration? I see that the OLR people that were there under Adams have been kept. So
Yes.
you see any change in approach with the new mayor and municipal labor in the city?
It's too early to tell. It's something that you've had mayors in the past who wanted to be able to treat the unions fairly. You've had others who have come in with a hard line. John Lindsay started out that way. It was true of Giuliani. It was true of Koch. Koch overall treated the unions fairly eventually after a lot of tough rhetoric that got him elected. But uh, Abe Beam ran into problems with the fiscal crisis. He wasn't able to do as much for the unions as he would have liked to. David Dinkins was very much pro-labor, but not only wasn't Dinkins able to give them much in collective bargaining, that they had a budget situation that by his second year in office, he was forced to lay off a couple of thousand people, which I think pained him greatly because he was someone who really did identify with city workers. In terms of de Blasio, there wasn't all that much that he was able to do. That the tabloids say that he gave away the store to the UFT in terms of its 2014 contract, which came 4 months into his term in office. But the truth was that Bloomberg had done a foolish thing in terms of refusing to bargain with the UFT and saying that there was not going to be any retroactivity and that he was not going to give the teachers the same raises that other people who had settled their contracts earlier had gotten. Because the big problem in terms of that the UFT and the PBA have always had this big gripe against pattern bargaining, which says that the first settlement is supposed to set a pattern for everyone else. They've always said that that was unfair to their members and that they could make a better case for excessive raises than those other unions could. And the problem with what Bloomberg looked to do was that if you said that there is no more continuation of pattern bargaining, if there is no more retroactivity, then what's going to happen when the PBA goes into arbitration and tells an arbitration panel, well, Bloomberg said that none of this stuff matters. Therefore, we want a 50% raise to put us on par with what cops in Long Island are getting. I mean, arbitrator would have had a tough time dealing with that simply because Bloomberg was trying to lay down this precedent of that all this labor history of the previous 40 or 50 years didn't matter. And so that it was something where uh, de Blasio was mindful of that. They worked out this deal, but they spread out the compensation in terms of retroactive money for several years. And while it looked like the UFT did extremely well, their overall contract was a record 9 years in length. They got those two 4% raises that everyone else had previously gotten. For the last 7 years of that contract, they were getting a total of 10% in raises. That's 1.4% a year on average, which was below the rate of inflation. And all the unions who had settled previously, they had to ask their members to accept the same meager terms for that 7 year period. So if de Blasio could have done more for the unions, he would have. But the fact is that he got labeled as having given away the store when, in fact, the unions did not do all that well under him. And the potential problem for Mondami is that you may have the same type of situation where he just does not have a whole lot of money in the pot. He's got a deficit to deal with. And as far as I know, none of the unions is rushing to get to the bargaining table because they understand that at the moment he is not in a position to offer them much of anything. I think they'd rather wait until the city's financial situation improves.
Yes. How do you feel about pattern bargaining? You think it works?
I think that to some degree it works, but you'll get, I mean, the cardinal example of how it doesn't work is the situation involving EMS workers. They were victimized because when they were setting out these bargaining relationships in the mid 1960s, they were under the control of the Health and Hospitals Corporation, and they didn't have nearly the same standards in terms of competence that they do today. And they have been unable to break out of being treated like second-class citizens in bargaining over the years. That the current situation, EMS people start slightly under 40,000, where firefighters who share the fire department with them at a time when the department is spending more time on medical calls by firefighters as well as EMTs, are you starting at 59,000? And the EMS top salary for a line worker is about 59,000. For firefighters, it's something a bit north of 100,000. There's no way that you can reconcile those things except for the fact that you talk about bargaining patterns. And either someone would have to do something really radical or they're going to have to chip away in arbitration, which up until now the EMS unions have been reluctant to do. But partly because you do it in bits and bytes, that you do it in terms of singles rather than in grand slam homers,
Yeah.
to put it in a baseball framework.
Yeah, I'm like I'm kind of undecided about pattern bargaining. I mean, there's a benefit obviously for the city because you
Yes.
have less controversy. This is the pattern. Or law will tell you, it's 2%. That's the pattern, and it doesn't take into consideration sometimes the complexity of certain jobs. Right? So it's a complicated scenario. In terms of a press coverage of municipal labor, I remember that. I mean, obviously, as the chief, but the Times, the Post, the Daily News, they used to have dedicated labor reporters, right? That's not the
Yes.
case anymore, I don't believe, right?
If you blame anybody for that, I'd probably blame the New York Times. That the Times used to have, in addition to their national labor reporter, they used to have a reporter who was dedicated to covering city labor. And they discontinued that around 1985 or so. And since then, it's been covered by somebody who works out of City Hall, although It's no longer out of City Hall. An awful lot of the times, people who are covering municipal government are not working from downtown, which I think probably hurts because there are things that you will see just in terms of people going in and out of the building that will sometimes give you information you're not otherwise going to get. Although there's always the feeling that someone will make a point to call the Times to let them know about it. But in any event, once they did it, the News and the Post both felt less pressure to go ahead with something like that. When I went to the Post in 1989, they made a decision that they were going to start up a labor column, and the notion was that it might help them in terms of circulation. I spent 4 years covering labor at the Post and got fired because of the strike. I think that after the strike, it wasn't something where the Post was going to pretend that it was pro-labor anymore, and so that they never did ask somebody to do it. And more often than not, when they're covering municipal labor, unless it's the police or some other union that they've designated as good people, it's going to be critically. They're going to be looking for ways to shoot holes in it. I mean, one of the traumatic experiences I had in my early days as a reporter at the Post was covering negotiations involving 1199, the private hospital workers union. Dennis Rivera was able to negotiate some remarkable contracts, and they announced the settlement about 8:30 in the morning after an all-night bargaining session. And I called in my story, was told I had the rest of the day off, and I went home, went to sleep, and I got a call at 3:30 in the afternoon from one of the editors who was asking me a question about something in my story, saying that the state was not going to be able to afford to pay for the increase that the 1199 people had, and I said that was not in my story. Basically, they took a story in which I suggested that Dennis Rivera, the head of 1199, had emerged as a new labor star, and decided that they didn't want to give him any good publicity. So they looked for a second angle, and the second angle was the state can't afford to, I mean, uh,
They try to put words in your mouth, basically, right? I mean,
essentially, yeah. Yeah. I mean, the Post is funny that way. I sometimes tell friends of mine that someday they're going to make the front of the paper something that the sports writers can be proud of, because to me, the only thing really worthwhile reading in the Post for a long time has been the sports section.
yeah, it's an incredibly biased paper. I mean, it's so blatant, it's ridiculous, but it is what it is. Some people love it, right? They love
They
their
may love it, but I think at some point you have to question how you could be saying that Mamdani is too radical when he hasn't accomplished very much yet, when he
no.
hasn't had a chance to do any real damage, and at the same time, the Post is basically lauding Trump, who is the most radical public official of my lifetime,
He's a
and
criminal.
probably most people's lifetime,
He's a criminal. It's incredible. It's
among
funny.
other things. Being a
I
criminal might be
I
the
talked to a
least of
report
his.
I
He's
talked
a
to
yeah. I mean,
I talked yeah, the guy, it's
he's a racist. He's a secessionist. Uh,
I've never seen
he's
anything like it, Richard. You and I have been around a long time. I've never seen anything like it. He's basically destroying not only the country but the world. I mean, it's unbelievable what he's doing. Every day
the
there's a
damage he's done to our reputation overseas. It's going to take years to patch up, simply because
yes.
people are going to say, well, okay, now you've got someone who's normal and stable back in charge, but who's to say that 4 years from now you won't have another Trump? And it's hard to answer that.
It's funny, but getting back to the Post, a reporter called from the Post yesterday, and I said, "Hey, are you guys going to skip a day beating the crap out of Mondani?" He said, "No, absolutely not."
Yeah.
He was honest about
He's being honest about it.
it. Yeah,
I mean,
he goes,
look, in terms of their front page, basically portraying him as a stick-up man, Mamdani is doing what you would expect him to do. Hochul said she's not going to give him what he wants in terms of taxing the wealthy, which is a natural position to take. It's something that Cuomo took during de Blasio's first year, that he knew that Not only he was opposed to it, but all the legislators who were up for another term did not want to be passing a tax increase at a time when they were running for something. Mamdani is trying to counter that by proposing this other alternative that's going to create an outcry. He's looking to use what leverage he has. Is he
Yeah.
right? I mean, I'm a homeowner, so it's not something that I'm thrilled about, but do I understand the notion of the gamesmanship that he's playing here, trying to get something out of the state that doesn't require him to raise property taxes? Yes.
Unfortunately, I think that's the whole thing is dead in the water. I mean, it's like I don't think he has any leverage left anymore. I mean, the council speaker said no go. People that support him say no go on property taxes. He's kind of doomed there. And if, but I understand the concept behind it. But I'm not sure. I'm not sure it was.
Bloomberg was able to push a property tax
Yeah.
through. On the other hand, Bloomberg had the ability to fund other people's campaigns in a way that that
And
the
it was, yeah,
council would go along with something like that.
and
Dan
it was, yeah,
Janison once said that Bloomberg had reversed the usual process of corruption, where instead of the officials in office being bribed, that he was sending the money back in the other direction.
yeah, I mean, it was also after 9/11, right? So, the city was in tough shape when he passed that huge real estate tax increase. One final question. I'll let you go. The uniformed union leadership. I remember when I was on the council, uh, most politicians in New York City coveted the support of the PBA, the DEA, the LBA, right? Uh, it seems now, although people claim that the police unions are extremely powerful and blah blah blah, it seems like that's not the case anymore. Many elected officials in New York City don't want to be endorsed by the PBA and DEA and the uniformed the union leaders. Is that accurate?
That's true in terms of the city council, which has moved distinctly to the left over the last decade. Whether it's true in Albany, I mean, they've also moved further to the left than they were once upon a time. But
I'm talking
uh,
about the city, Rich, in the city.
yeah, well, in the city, I mean, you had the defund the police movement. You had some prominent elected officials. I mean, if de Blasio wasn't fully endorsing that, he was making changes that had the impact of making cops' jobs tougher. You had
Yeah.
someone like Brad Lander who was out there on defund the police. You had a number of council people who were out there on defund the police. That there is no question that the council as a body has moved further to the left than it was when you were serving there.
Oh yeah, well, that's for sure. Richard, I really thank you for spending time talking about. I could talk to you forever about this stuff.
I got an inner circle rehearsal to get to.
All right. Listen, thank you so much.
Sure thing, Sal.
Well, hopefully we can get together for lunch one day down the
That'd be
road.
fine.
All right, Richard.
Okay.
Have a good day. Thank you. Bye.
Sure, Sal. Take care.